Hey guys, just wanted to show a little breakdown of the Gen 3 Scarab. I don't think I've taken one of these apart on the channel yet, so just wanted to give a little walkthrough and breakdown and show you guys full disassembly. So this is the DES. It's in an apocalyptic finish, and you can see it's got the sharpened back edge, but it's in kind of the single edge blade shape. So they released these a couple months ago. Just going to disengage the blade from the spring carriage. So this is free floating now, there's no tension on it. And we can go ahead and take off the screws. This you just use a T8 for. So we're going to go ahead and loosen all these up. And kind of like any OTF, whenever you're disassembling and reassembling, you really shouldn't need a ton of force to do anything. On most of these, it's an aluminum chassis or an aluminum body, so you're going to have either titanium or steel screws. They're going to be a lot stronger than the aluminum, so if you end up torquing too hard, it's really easy to strip threads. Then you're going to have to either, drill out to the next size and get different size screws that'll work, or send it back and see if they can helicoil in there or something. Just a problem you don't want to deal with. So always when you're disassembling these, you want to keep pressure on the button and then just kind of wiggle the top to take it off. So it starts to move and then it'll come right off. So you can see right there. And then there is a spring under the button, so you just want to hinge it open like that. So you can see it's here, and it's just gonna push open, and then you can take it out, and we've got the button and the spring. So just a little walkthrough of the button first. You have the spring inside, which I should be able to get out easier than I am right now, but you can see it's got a flange like all the others. So this is one of the rare, Gen 3s. The Scarab is the only one that I know of that still has this flange on the bottom. The rest of them have kind of gone to a slotted design in the sides. So you can see that this one is got a flange. It's wider on the bottom than everywhere else. Most of the new buttons, they are the same width on the top as they are on the bottom, and there's just a little slot right here that the body can slide into. So this one, they kept basically the same width as the previous Gen Scarab, kind of the same design. The only thing that's really changed is this isn't a through slot here. And then you have that nice shiny track on the bottom where the button slides up against the chassis. So having that nice shiny surface instead of blasted is going to reduce your friction coefficient, makes it easier to deploy. So it's a good move on their part to keep the surface finish on there good. Doesn't need to be super high polished, but it definitely helps reduce friction. As far as everything else, this has the Gen 3 drivetrain like most of the new knives. You can see this one actually says Scarab 2 on it, which is kind of unique. I don't think I've seen that on any of the other Gen 3 knives that I've taken apart. So that's kind of cool. They're probably just doing that for keeping track of it in-house would be my guess. So removing this spring carriage, I really like this design a whole lot better than what they were doing previously. So essentially it's all sort of maintained as a single unit, and unlike before, it doesn't pop apart readily. So you can see if you look close, if I can get it to focus, there's these little prongs that kind of stick over the backside of the spring carrier itself, which is great because it means that I can't push this out of place. And if you guys have ever disassembled an older Ultratech or any older Microtech OTF in the first place, you'll know they used kind of milled tabs, and those would either just be bent or they would be milled, and there was no retention feature to it. So this, they've got the retention on it. You can't push this apart like that. In order to fully take it apart, you actually need to pull it, and then you can disassemble it like that. So these parts, I think, are a huge improvement, right? There's no bent pieces, there's no sharp edges or anything. It's all good and smooth, and there's a healthy wall thickness kind of all around. I don't have my calipers out here right now, but the wall thickness on this is definitely such that you'll be a lot less worried or less likely to have any issues, in my opinion. And I think from what I've seen online, there's a lot fewer issues with this Gen 3 drivetrain than there were with the most recent like metal injection molded parts that they were using. Now, I'd say in all likelihood, these probably are still metal injection molded. You can kind of see these circles on the top. It's unlikely that that's used for any fixturing in any machines or anything. They're probably just remnants from the die that these are shot into. However, I'd say even with the metal injection, this is still a better piece, a good improvement over the bent tabs like they used before. I think the only way you're gonna get anything stronger than the metal injection is if they go straight to billet pieces. So if they're milling everything out, which if you were to try and make this out of steel in a mill or anything, you definitely can, you know, it's a piece that you can make, but you've got some undercuts, you've got some overhanging parts. It's definitely a 2-operation part unless you make it in a 4 or 5 axis machine. It's just gonna be at the scale that Microtech is producing their knives, it makes a whole lot more sense to go with something like this. Springs are definitely a different size than what the previous knives were, and then this spring carrier is just probably laser cut sheet metal. It's either water jet, laser cut, something like that. So they can crank a bunch of those out. It's flat. There's no real details in it. You'll remember in the old ones, there's a big slot right down the middle for the springs to slide into. And with the new design, they don't have to do that. So it's decreasing cost on their internals. There's no real benefit from having that in the first place. So I think it's a good move on their end. Now, onto the blade, you can see the only real difference with the chassis on these is you've got this longer tab, and then these are both on the same side. So both of my locking tabs, the front position and the rear position tabs are both on the, I guess, left side of the blade, the side opposite where the trigger is. So from a design standpoint, not super important. I think the best thing about that for Microtech is what they used to have to do, because the locking gate used to be under the trigger. Basically only on the backside edges, the models that had the backside edge, so your DEs and your bayonets and stuff like that, they would need to cut a notch inside these locking gates. So you've got some knives that have a notch and some knives that don't. Not a huge deal from production from their standpoint, but for aftermarket, it's certainly a whole lot easier to have one style. So like if you want to swap the blade from a DES into an SE, there's no problem, or vice versa, which makes it a lot easier for guys that want to swap the blade in their knives to do so without needing to worry about it. So just pulling out the stop pin. Now, this is definitely different from what they were doing previously. The old Scarab was just a round pin. So this is kind of an oval pin, and it's got a little slot in the bottom, which when we take the blade out, we'll see what the purpose for that is. But overall, it's, you know, serves the same function essentially. So this sticks through to the other side of the blade, serves as a stop pin to prevent over travel. So that way, when it hits the edge of the knife, it'll stop, and then it comes back and rests up against the locking tab. So we'll show that when I get back to disassembly, but that is that piece. And then without the stop pin, I can pull this blade straight out. You can see this has the fluting. So the fluting is designed that way you can eject water from the knife, or I mean, if you're firing this thing underwater, then good for you, I guess. But also for cleaning, it's super nice too. So if you're ever cleaning the knife, you can spray in your rem oil and everything, and you don't need to sit there and drain the knife upside down for 15 minutes and wait for the oil to come out. You can spray the oil in, wait a couple minutes, take some compressed air and blow it out. And then on the back side, you've also got these large drain ports. So the oil is just gonna flush right through, or I guess the oil carrier with something like rem oil is gonna flush right through, and then it'll be out. So that's good. Yeah, I mean, as far as a blade design, there's nothing crazy going on here that I can talk to. I think it's a cool blade shape. I'm glad that they finally brought this back. It's been quite a few years since they ran production of a DES. I know that a couple years ago, they had a Scarab 2 DES custom, RPO custom that came out, but that's the most recent there that they brought back into production. So from a design standpoint on the chassis, you can kind of see it's roughly the same. The only difference is this slot is a little bit longer to make up for the additional, I guess, width or length of the stop pin chassis. So something interesting, or at least that I find interesting, is that that stop pin isn't really doing anything other than providing a little bit of clearance for fluid to get through. So it's a pretty cool thought out design, right? Because if I drop the blade back in place, you can see, now we've got it like that. You can kind of see if you look straight down, I mean, it's tough to see light through, but it lines up with the flutes in the blade, right? So it's cool that they thought that through, that, you know, if you're gonna be firing this underwater, you want the most clearance that you can get. So with a slot, or a slotted feature like this, you have it directionally oriented. So when you stick this in the knife, it's not like if you had a round pin and you tried to put a slot through, that pin can spin around, and you could have that sideways, you could have it angled a little bit, but this is always going to be aligned to the front of the knife, which is cool. So that they're thinking through the actual feature of it being able to fire underwater, or at least it being able to drain fluid out. Just gives you more area, more volume that it can drain through, which is a good thought. So we're going to go ahead, take the clip off now. I'm not going to take the locking tabs and everything out. Those are still the same. Maybe I'm not going to take this out. This is really in there. I think I'm going to leave that for today. I don't really feel like stripping it. But you can see on the bottom side, hopefully, it's kind of an interesting piece, which is why I wanted to show it. But you've got some milling in the bottom. So they're kind of cross milling it through there, and probably for lightening it up. But those actually may be the through holes, and it may be draining directly through there, which is kind of what it looks like to me. So it's a pretty interesting design. There's no real way for me to show it on camera, but there you go. You can kind of see the cross straight through there. So those are actually the holes that run through the entire body of the glass breaker. So you've got flushing through there too. So really, I mean, for a use standpoint, the thing that they kind of designed this for and being able to fire underwater, I think they're kind of knocking it out of the park. I think they're doing a really good job thinking through all the design features, making sure there's water clearance and everything through there. And then I guess I can show you guys this too. So the locking tab here, if you remember, I was talking a second ago about the slotting. So this, you can see there's the slot in there. So that's to make sure it doesn't rub up against your blade edge and ruin the edge. You don't need it on the back end. I'll show that when we're putting it back together. But on the back end, it kind of locks into this little notch here. So it's never gonna be touching this edge. It's just not possible with the geometry of the knife unless it's broken in the first place. So don't need to worry about that. So it's fully disassembled except for the clip, which I would have liked to take apart, but I don't really feel like wrecking the knife, so not today. Disassembling, we're gonna take the knife, lock it off track, right? Because if you take that out, it's not gonna be able to go back in, so you just need to actuate this little locking tab and then slide it back in. You don't wanna go all the way to the back tab. I guess I can show this while I'm here, right? So you can see the little notch that's cut in, and then just gonna drop in right there. And you can see there's a little play, and that's gonna allow you to have room to fully retract and then have the spring tension on the blade ready to pull it out. So now I'm gonna drop in the stop pin. Doesn't look like there's a front and a back. I hope there isn't a front and a back. I guess we're gonna find out. And try and drop her in. All right, so that's dropped in. Now we've got the stop pin in there. Make sure the blade's all good. And then reassembling this on camera is probably gonna be nice and embarrassing. So we're here, all right. Nope, all right. I am sure there's a better way to do this, and you guys can let me know, but the dual fuel, you know, dealing with two springs at once, just not really a good time. I mean, I get the point, and I kind of like it's not really a fail-safe, but it is reducing the load on the springs, which is good. But from an assembly and disassembly standpoint, can be a pain. Now, there's no reason you need to take these out unless you've found a source for springs or anything and you break a spring and you need to replace them. But you'll see now I've got The spring's attached to both tabs, and you're just gonna take this and push it over. One other thing I don't think I mentioned before about the spring tabs is that they seem to be universal kind of front to back, right? Previously there was a front tab and a back tab. Now you've got two of the same, which even lends itself better to the higher production numbers. So they're really trying to crank out knives at Microtech, and having more universal parts and less unique parts. You know, even something like the spring tabs, you're using one in every knife. Now there's two of the same in every knife. It's one less part they've got to keep track of and keep inventory of and manufacture and all that good stuff. So good design on their end. Next, putting the spring back in the button. So right there, and dropping the button back into place. All right. And then you want to make sure that you're actually properly locked in. So we're good here, which is solid. Now taking the top, and dropping the top back on, and make sure it's fully seated before you try and tighten anything down. So you can see there's no air gap in one side, no air gap in the other side. So now we can drop in one screw, which is typically the way I like to do the assembly on these. Well, if I can actually get the bit in. So you just want one to hold it in place. And like always, you just want to go finger tight. You don't need to crank the hell out of the screws. I can't stress it enough. You really, really, really do not want to strip any of the body on the knives. And it's not an easy thing to fix. You'll have to drill and tap to the next size and then figure out a way to get a screw in there. If you didn't strip it too bad, you can always put something like Teflon tape around the screw and hold it in there, but then you're just hoping that the screw doesn't fall out. So not really a position you want to be in, not something you want to have to worry about. So avoid it if you can. Don't tighten everything like crazy. Everything's going to stay pretty snug in the first place. You know, get it good and comfortably tight, but you don't need to go nuts and torque the hell out of everything. So now that we've got all the screws back in, we can make sure the button's not binding, so we're all good there. And then we're going to take the knife blade, and with these you can just pull it straight out to re-engage the spring. So we've got it all re-engaged. Now we can retract and fire. And this dual fuel drivetrain really is really great to operate. I mean, compared to the older knives, I know some people say they don't really notice much of a difference, but I'd say there's a significant difference in how easy these are to fire. Maybe I'll pull a spring gauge and figure out exactly how hard to fire the old ones are versus the new ones and what the reduction is in force, but it's significant. Now, design-wise, I really like the way the Scarab looks. It's got some cool features on it. This kind of engraved pattern on the sides that was in the old Ultratechs. They phased out in like the 2007, 2008 time range. And they still have this on the Scarabs, which I think is really, really cool. It's a nice detail. It's just another blank space for them to work with. So I think filling that with something is definitely a good idea, right? Even on the new ZBT Ultratechs, it's just kind of blank, which is, it's fine, it's acceptable, but it's not like the prettiest thing in the world, right? I think having the little bit of extra texture and more importantly, for me at least, just the look, I think is really cool. It's a little more aggressive, it just looks nice, but it's more machine time, so it's gonna add cost to everything, which I get. So there's that. This has the crud cutter in here, which I've seen some talking online about lately, that a lot of the purpose behind this is to actually catch lint, so that way it's not getting into the body of the knife. I think it's an interesting thought, especially because the spring carriage arm that kind of stuck through, that's gone down to about 63 thousandths or 64 thousandths in width. And in the older knives, it's always been about 1/8 of an inch. I think in the old Scarabs, it was even thicker. It might be like 150 thou. So it's a smaller hole into the chassis, which is good for contamination purposes. So if the idea was to kind of trap all the lint in here instead of letting it get into the knife, I think it's cool. Maybe I'll have to read into the patents on that and see what the deal is. I've been carrying this a fair amount lately. The ZBT still kind of takes the cake for me, just the rigidity and not having any blade play. So I've really been enjoying this a little bit more, but My real complaints with the Scarab 2 Gen 3, right? It's super, super thick, in my opinion at least. The Gen 3 Ultratech or the ZBT Ultratech is significantly thinner. Now you include the clip and everything, and maybe it's not so crazy of a difference, but the clip is outside your pocket. The part that's inside your pocket in this knife is massive, for me at least. I mean, I think it's a huge knife. I can definitely notice when I'm carrying it, and it's not my favorite to carry, but it's a good solid knife. It's got a good blade shape, and it's full size. So between this and the Combat Troodon, which is got basically the same blade length, I like the Combat Troodon better. It's a little bit slimmer. I like the design a little bit more. I don't really need the grip tape inlays or the texturing on the side or anything for use, right? It's not like I'm using knives with my hands soaking wet and really need that texture. I've never even had a problem with kind of the smooth body knives like this, where when you're holding it. I feel like the little jimping is more than enough for me to have texture on and get a grip on the knife. But it looks cool, right? And especially you can get some custom inlays made for these that can look really sharp, can look really nice. So I could definitely understand it, and having a little bit of extra texture I see the benefit in. For me, it's not a big deal, but I know for some people it's definitely an important feature. The dual fuel is great, I think. As far as cleanings and lubrication goes, having this fluting in here, so that way you can do it on the fly and not need to disassemble the whole knife, I think is great. You can see those big drainage ports on the bottom too. So those are straight open up, and then you just have a lot of room for fluid to move in and around, especially on something like this where it's not a lockup mechanism like the ZBT. This will run with more dirt and more gunk and more grime inside the body of the knife than something like this will, where it's got a fairly complex locking mechanism compared to this, right? The only thing I need for this knife to lock up is for the blade to get all the way out to the open position, and for that locking tab to get in the way of the back of the blade so it can't retract back in. That's all there is to it. There's nothing complex about how this operates, and even if your knife does fail, being able to just blow it out or rinse it out in some water or whatever and give it another shot at least is definitely going to be easier than something like this. So I think it's a good knife. I think it's solid. I like the Microtech designs. I think they're really cool looking knives. Function-wise, it seems like they really thought through everything in this design. Like I was showing the internals where they have directional slots and a directional stop pin in there. So it's a cool idea, and I think it's a solid knife. This glass breaker is definitely much more expensive to manufacture than the other ones, just because they're drilling that hole in from the back end too. So instead of just parting it off like they normally would, now they've got to drill a hole from the back end. Now they're doing these on a Swiss machine. It's not a big deal on a Swiss, but it is just another thing for them to add as an operation. It adds time and it adds cost and it adds complexity and everything. So that's a nice feature as well, because then instead of just the two drain ports effectively, now you've got the entire interior, that glass breaker as well, that's going to be doing the same thing. So pretty interesting. I don't know if I've seen another knife with something like that in the past. So pretty cool design on that front. Button design I think is okay. The X button is real pinchy. For me, I'm not a huge fan of it. This one, just because it's so wide and so big, it's a lot more comfortable. But I know some of the narrower ones, like the Troodon and the older Combat Troodon before they widen the button up, those could be very uncomfortable to actuate. It's just a narrow button. Something like the X button really kind of pinches your thumb into place, which is good for deploying it, right? It'll lock everything in and make sure you won't slip off the button, but it's a whole lot less comfortable. I really wish they'd bring something back like these C design like they used to use. So for me, it's just as comfortable or it's just as easy to deploy, right? You're not going to slip off or anything, but you don't get the same pinching, right? So you can see the difference in aggression here. It would be a lot more obvious if I had Combat Troodon or even like the Mini Hera or something, the X's on those. It's a lot more aggressive. and it can be pinchy and kind of uncomfortable. But this button is so wide that it's, you know, it's going to be comfortable basically no matter what you do. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. Let me know what you guys think about the Gen 3 Scarabs, if it's better, if it's worse than the previous Scarab 2. I think these are solid. It's a good knife. It's a little big for me, but I think they're solid. So let me know what you think.